And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Supposed to be Two Guys in a Bible. I sent William a link a few moments ago, a little bit tight on the schedule when I sent it. And lo and behold, there he is. And so we welcome William Bell into our studio. And in the meantime, let me say again how much we appreciate him joining us here this afternoon. And we're going to continue. There he is. There's the man. How
How
you
are you?
doing, William?
Good, good. How are you?
Uh-oh.
Can't hear? Let's see.
Nope.
How's that?
Nope. Still no audio from you, William.
Wow. Okay.
So William trying to work out his technical problems there. And I'm giving you a fair warning, ladies and gentlemen. My voice is just about shot. I had a 2 hour blog, or what do you want to call it, this afternoon. I thought it was supposed to be an hour. It extended into 2 hours with a Q&A session during it. And my voice is just pretty weak, and I don't know how that's going to work. William, I still don't have anything from you.
How about now?
Nope. Nope.
Wow.
Still don't have anything. So anyway, by the end of the 2 hours, my voice was very, very weak. Now William's got this. You call it a witch's brew, William? Of stuff that it's a concoction, as I remember, of honey and lemon and whoever knows what else. I'm going to have to find that. You sent it to me, but anyway, getting ready to go to Australia. And they had me down to speak at least 6 times. Uh, I think maybe it's actually eight. Nope, no sound. And so I'm eight, like 6 or 8 times in 2.5 days. I don't know how I'm going to do that. Not after the 2 hour round today. Let me use my little puffer here.
Still no sound.
Sorry about that. So, William, having any luck there?
Apparently not.
Nope, no
Not
luck at
yet.
all.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to restart my computer, reboot, and see if that
Nope,
solved the
I don't
problem.
hear a thing.
Okay. Let me see if I
Okay,
can.
you can just carry on there. As promised, and we are continuing our study of the Messianic temple, and we've been focused the last couple of weeks on Hebrews chapter 9, and how significant the text is. The writer tells us there was no access into the most holy place, i.e., heaven itself, as long as the old covenant system stood valid, stood binding, imposed. And he says it was imposed until the time of Reformation. Nope, nothing there. And so, what I want to do tonight, and as soon as we get William online with some audio here, we're going to have him expound on this. But there are two aspects of what the writer says in Hebrews chapter 9. He says that old covenant system stood, it meets and drinks and carnal ordinances, or washings, different washings, baptismois, uses the plural noun there. And by the way, some people try to say that the baptismois there of Hebrews chapter 9 is the baptism that we read about in Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 8, Acts chapter 10, Acts 16, etc. Not that at all. The New Testament writers never imposed on either Jew or Gentile. They never imposed the Old Testament baptisms. And they certainly never imposed those baptisms on Gentiles. And so for someone to suggest that baptism in the New Testament, for instance, in Acts chapter 8 and the Ethiopian eunuch, when Philip baptized the eunuch, to suggest that that was just another one of the many Old Testament washings is simply not true. There's no validity to that argument, as far as I can tell, because those washings were simply for the purification of the flesh, to put away the filth of the flesh. The New Testament writers say that baptism was not for the purifying of the flesh, not for the taking away of physical dirt, so to speak, but it was rather an appeal to God for a clean conscience. When Peter says that baptism was an answer, that's a wrong translation. It is from the Greek word aperotima, and it's an appeal. It is a prayer to God for a clean conscience. So I just wanted to clear that up as a relatively minor point and what I want to get to tonight. So the writer of Hebrews says that the old covenant system stood meats, drinks, divers washings, etc., etc. Now, it is a fascinating study, I must say, to study all of the different reasons why and all of the different occasions why people under Torah had to purify themselves. There were scattered all around Jerusalem. So, archaeologists have found literally thousands of what they call mikvah. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly or not. But what were these? These were literally immersion pools. There were pools scattered literally all over Jerusalem, so that, number one, before entering into Jerusalem, you would go down into a mikvah, a pool. There's a book that was written some years ago about the mystery of the mikvah. A really fascinating book. And I would suggest and recommend that anyone that can get a hold of that, get a hold of it, because it talks about the significance, the meaning, and the importance of the mikvah in the Jewish mind. Part of the point being here, these pools were everywhere, which meant that the Jews were constantly engaging in ritual immersions. And by the way, they were pools. They didn't go to the edge of the pool, grab a little splash of water and throw it in their face. They went down into the pool and they immersed themselves. And that shows you the significance and the meaning and the definition of baptisma, singular, okay, or in this case of Hebrews 9, of plural. All of these different immersions, because that's what they engaged in. But here's the point that I want to really get to, all right? The point that I want to get to is that he says that old covenant system stood in all of those meats and drinks and divers washings, et cetera, all sorts of carnal ordinances. The reality is that he has in mind here the Jewish feast days, the festal observances, because you see, every single feast day in Israel's calendar, and that included the Sabbath is the very first feast day of Israel listed in Leviticus chapter 23. And which means, by the way, when people talk about the Sabbath, well, that's a feast of the Lord. That's not the feast of Israel. No, they were all feast days of the Lord. There's no distinction. And so each one of those feast days, and again, Sabbath was the number one feast in the list of the feast of God, the feast of the Lord. What is important, this is the point that I want to get to, is that all of those feast days, including the Sabbath, were shadows of the good things about to come. They were not themselves the end. They were not the goal. They were not the totality. They contained within themselves And years ago, I heard David Curtis say, and I followed up on it, and he was accurate on this, as I expected he would be. Throughout Leviticus chapter 23, those feast days, those Sabbaths were all called convocations of the Lord. What did what did convocation mean? It meant a rehearsal. The Jews were supposed to realize that in observing the feast days, and that again included the seventh-day Sabbath, those festal ordinances were looking forward to, they were foreshadowing, they were prefiguring something beyond themselves. Now, that ought to tell us something, and I'm going to send William another invitation here very, very quickly. So everyone just stay with me here for just one moment as I send this invitation again. There we are. Message has been sent. Alrighty. So we will get back over here. There we are. So when we understand that those feast days were foreshadowings, they were prophetic, in other words. They look forward to something else. What did Sabbath? And by the way, virtually every one of the feast days was a Sabbath. They were supposed to work until the time of that feast day, and they were not supposed to work at all during the observance of those feast days. This was particularly true, obviously, of the seventh-day Sabbath. It was true especially of Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Absolutely no work at all. So if you're observing feast days, and the key element of the feast day was no work to be done at all, what do you suppose that foreshadowed? It foreshadowed not a literal physical cessation of work, but it foreshadowed a greater spiritual reality of resting from our labors. Revelation chapter 14, verse 13, in describing the post-parousia world, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from henceforth, for yea, says the Lord, they shall rest from their labors. So here's a promise for all of those who die in the Lord post-parousia, that we rest from our labors. We rest from this life, that's to be sure, but we rest from our labors. I've got to tell this little anecdote here very quickly. Some years ago, I had after the controversy sprang out at the Maxwell Avenue Church of Christ, where I was a preacher and ultimately got fired from there. There was a preacher from across town. Well, he had been across town, and he and I used to converse a little bit, not just a whole lot, but he sort of kind of considered himself to be God's answer to the world of theology. He thought he had all the answers. So he wrote me this really pretty caustic, pretty nasty, certainly very, very sarcastic letter. And he said, you obviously haven't thought much about your position. And he said, if you can show me one single text. Now, by the way, this is before the days of email, the olden days. If you can show me, and I had no cell phone either, by the way, if you can show me just one single verse of what we have after AD 70, in your view, after the coming of the Lord, then he said, I will actually sit down and study with you. And I wrote back and I told him, well, how many verses you want? But here's one. Consider the following. And I just typed out in this letter, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from henceforth, for yea, they shall rest from their labors. And I pointed out, well, here's what we've got. We've got the day of the Lord, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, at the time of the harvest. And after that event, what do we have? People dying in the Lord. That means people are dying, still living life as human beings, and yet still dying. So we have William trying to log on here. Let's see if we can get him to come up and have some audio. I still don't hear. Nope, don't hear a thing, William.
I'm going to sign in on my phone.
I don't know. I don't have a clue what you said. Yeah. Okay. There you go. Try that. So I've got my phone right here. I'll set it up very close to the camera, and we'll set it up close to the microphone, as a matter of fact. And we will see if we can't get this. See if we can't get this done. So anyway, I wrote to this fellow, and I gave him Revelation 14:13. Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, they shall rest from their labors. And I said, here are people still dying after the day of the Lord. So when do you want to get together and study? That was the last letter I ever got from this guy. And I mean, what can you say? That there was such a sense of arrogance there. And yet, even though he had made a promise to study with me about covenant eschatology, he obviously didn't mean it. So it's just one of many, many, many examples that could be given in which people have a preconceived idea about what it would be like after the day of the Lord, after the coming of the Lord. And when they're shown that that preconceived idea is absolutely false, all of a sudden they just bail out. As I sometimes, okay, there, we'll hit that admit button again there, William. Progress. Okay. Okay, William's still messing with buttons.
Okay, I'm trying to get rid of the.
I cannot hear a word you're saying.
All right.
I don't know what happened.
How's that?
Okay. Well, I will continue. Okay, so everything that I've said up to this point, and you can hear me correctly? I mean,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Well, maybe you'll find the right button here in a moment. Normally, as you know, it's nothing but one button, nothing but one switch. And it's like, when did I flip that switch? How did I do that? So anyway, the point that I want to make here, ladies and gentlemen, is that those feast days were types and shadows of the good things. Let's go to Colossians chapter 2. Now, mind you, Hebrews tells us that those feast days, that is to say, the new moons, the feast days of the Sabbaths, the meats and the drinks and the carnal ordinances, would stand imposed until the time of Reformation. Well, why is that? Because they had a typological significance. They had a prophetic significance that would remain valid until the typological significance of those feast days was fulfilled. Let me express it like this. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18, do not think that I am come to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. Now, let me ask you something, ladies and gentlemen. Were the feast days part of the law? Well, I would suggest to you that the festal ordinances, which are found again in Leviticus chapter 23, Numbers chapter 28, are not only the law, they are a massive part of the jots and the tittles of the law. I mean, after all, the observance of the feast days involved what? It involved 3 annual trips to Jerusalem there to observe these annual feast days. So to suggest that the feast days were not the law, violates everything about the old covenant. Are you with us, Sir William? Do we have any sound?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Nope, still no
Hmm.
sound.
That's strange. Not even on the phone.
Let me see here. Say something now.
All right, test 1, 2.
Nope, nothing. Okay, I don't know what our problem is, but I have nothing from you at all whatsoever.
Okay.
I mean, you're obviously there and what have you. So I will carry on. We will try this again. I'll send you another invitation. Go ahead and log off, and I'll send you another link. So Jesus said, not one jot, not one tittle of the law. And remember, the law comprised or was comprised of, inclusive of, the feast days. There's simply no way around this. Those attempts by my Sabbatarian friends, for instance, to say, well, the law was simply the Decalogue, just the 10 Commandments. Well, guess what? That would mean that the Sabbath was a feast day. And until the feast days, the feast day of the Sabbath, the seventh day Sabbath, found its fulfillment in salvation, in resurrection, it would stand valid. I would be perfectly willing to make that argument or to grant that argument because, because Sabbath foreshadowed resurrection, salvation, rest. And William, you can shake your head yes on that if you agree. Oh, there he went. Okay. Yeah, there you go. Well, see, William's participating after all. Okay. So with that said, okay, point number one, the law was more than the Decalogue. There's no question about that. Those who attempt to say that the law simply referred to the Ten Commandments are they're not on solid theological ground in any shape, form, or fashion. But notice that Jesus said, "Do not think that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets." And I want to give us a little bit of a grammatical lesson here. What Jesus was doing in Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18 was speaking elliptically. And we'll get William to shake his head or nod his head on this here in a minute. Okay. What do we mean by ellipsis or elliptical? We mean that a person says something, but then they say almost the same thing, but they leave off part of it. In other words, when Jesus says, "Do not think that I am come to destroy the law of the prophets," I did not come to destroy what? The law of the prophets. I came to fulfill. Fulfill what? The law and the prophets. So Jesus is speaking elliptically, and he didn't have to say law and prophets over and over and over again. Because in an elliptical statement, all he had to say, "Don't think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy the law of the prophets. I came to fulfill the law and the prophets. For verily I say unto you, until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot, not one tittle of the law or the prophets shall pass away." Now, when we allow the grammar of the text in that manner, all right, going to send William one more link here. When we allow the text to speak in that manner, and what you got to do, folks, honestly, all you got to do is look up what ellipsis means, and you'll see I am absolutely telling the truth on this. William, are you with us on ellipsis?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Okay. Oh, you're a great help here, William. Okay, so here is Jesus saying that he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. That means he did not come to fulfill just one aspect of the law, i.e., the Decalogue, He came to fulfill the prophetic element. So here's where this comes into play on Hebrews chapter 9. The law, the festal observances included, was an inherent foundational part of the law. And those festal ordinances would stand imposed until the time of Reformation. Now, here are these festal ordinances that foreshadowed, follow me very closely here, ladies and gentlemen, those festal ordinances, including the Sabbath. You read G.K. Beale in his theology of the New Testament, in his discussion of the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath. He said the seventh-day Sabbath foreshadowed the final salvation rest. I don't know of scholars who disagree with this. So essentially what this means is scholarship, the Jews agreed with this, the rabbis agreed with this, that, okay, I'm going to send another invite. We're going to try this one more time. So scholarship, as well, both Jewish and non-Jewish scholars agree, and they teach that, guess what? The Sabbath foreshadowed ultimate final salvation. Well, guess what? As I pointed out already, virtually all of the feast days were Sabbaths. That meant that they foreshadowed the coming of final salvation. Yom Kippur was almost what you could almost call the ultimate Sabbath. And the reason I say that is because just like the seventh-day Sabbath, and violation of the seventh-day Sabbath carried with it the death penalty, anyone who failed to observe Sabbath and the proper observance of Yom Kippur was subject to the death penalty. So here we have the importance and the typological significance of the feast days. And the writer saying of Hebrews, those festal observances would stand imposed. The Greek word epikaimai, that's the basic form, until the time of Reformation. And it literally means legally imposed until the time of Reformation. So what's it saying? It means that those feast days, with their typological significance, would stand valid, stand imposed until what they foreshadowed became a reality. Now then, let's go over, as I mentioned a few moments ago, let's go over to Colossians chapter 2. The historical context of Colossians chapter 2 is, is that Jewish Christians were trying to force Gentiles, non-Israelite, converts to Christ. These were individuals that were probably not, almost certainly not, even proselytes. Point of fact is they're Gentiles. And the Jewish Christians were saying they had to keep the law of Moses and be circumcised to be saved. Now, for those who say, well, yeah, you got the Sabbath, that's the Lord's Sabbath, but then you have the rest of the feast days. And those are the law of Moses. Folks, there is no such distinction.
How about now?
Nope. Nope. He's giving it the old college try, though. So that's the historical context of Colossians chapter 2. Jewish Christians trying to impose the law of Moses. Well, okay, that means they were trying to impose the feast days. And remember, first of all, seventh-day Sabbath was the very first of feast days. Nope, nothing. There is no way to say, well, they weren't trying to impose Sabbath because that was understood that they would keep the Sabbath. There's nothing about it in Acts chapter 15. There's nothing about it anywhere else that Sabbath was to be imposed, but the rest of the feast days were not to be imposed. That is a false delineation. It's a false dichotomy. It is simply invalid. So, in Colossians chapter 2, Paul addresses the situation in which the Gentiles were being coerced by the Jewish Christians to be physically circumcised. Now, this is a really fascinating and significant issue. Why? Because physical circumcision was not fundamentally a law of Moses ordinance. Now, don't anybody say, oh, Preston's saying that the law of Moses did not command circumcision. I didn't say that at all. But circumcision was intrinsically an Abrahamic covenant promise. All you have to do is go back to Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 17. Genesis chapter 12, particularly, God made a covenant with Abraham that on the 8th day, every male child would be circumcised. And he said, this is my covenant between you and me for throughout your generations and your seed, your offspring throughout your generations. Now, the stunning thing about this is when we come to the New Testament, Paul especially teaches physical circumcision was not the law of Christ. Now, wait a minute. You've got the covenant of Abraham. That transcends everything, right? The law of Moses was added to the Abrahamic covenant, according to Galatians chapter 4. And yet here is Paul saying physical circumcision avails nothing. This I testify and say that those who seek to be justified by the law of Moses, specifically now, in this case, circumcision, you are fallen from grace. For neither circumcision avails anything, or uncircumcision avails anything, but grace which works, or faith which works through love. So here's Paul saying, look, the Abrahamic covenant of physical circumcision was valid and binding as a physical covenant between Abraham and even Israel, but the time had come in which the significance, the covenantal significance of physical circumcision had been fulfilled, was being fulfilled. And so Paul could write to the Colossians and he could say, you have been circumcised. Now, here are the Judaizers saying, oh, you got to be circumcised. You got to be circumcised. And Paul says, you have been. Not by being circumcised in the flesh, but with the circumcision of the heart, the circumcision not made with hands, being buried with him by baptism, wherein also you raised with him through faith in the operation of God. Paul puts circumcision into the spiritual realm, into the unseen realm. Physical circumcision was the external sign of sonship. Christian circumcision is of the heart and is absolutely not visible. I had somebody ask me just recently, and William, you and I have been asked this question a million times. Okay, what changed in AD 70? Well, here's one of the really, really biggies. Prior to that time, the Jews continued circumcision, and they still do, of course. But the Christians were undergoing a transition in which the teaching was physical circumcision is no longer valid. It is no longer the guarantee of the covenant. It is circumcision of the heart. I would ask you to chime in here, William, but because I know you've got some really good thoughts on this. But folks, I hope you see the significance of what we're saying here. And all of this, remember, is absolutely integrally related to, inseparably bound up with the doctrine of, guess what? The Messianic temple. What did you have to do to enter into the literal physical temple at Jerusalem? Well, number one, you had to be physically circumcised. Everyone remember Acts chapter 21. Some of the Jews believed that Paul took Trophimus, an uncircumcised Greek, into the temple. Now, a little bit of a historical and archaeological point here. Archaeologists have found tablets. If I remember correctly, they're about this long and about this tall. And inscribed on the stones was the message: any uncircumcised Gentile beyond this point will bear the responsibility for his own death. Now, this is remarkable. The Romans had taken away the right of capital punishment from the Jews well before the first century. But because of the sanctity of the temple itself, they had allowed them to literally kill any Gentile that was caught beyond that middle wall of partition. So, in order to enter beyond that middle wall of partition, you absolutely had to be circumcised. By the way, you had to be baptized. More technically speaking, and I don't know how many people realize this, but folks, a proselyte to Judaism was never circumcised. I'm sorry, excuse me. They were never baptized. What did it mean to be baptized? Well, this is an interesting facet of, of the Greek text. For instance, just one example, on the day of Pentecost, when Peter preached to the audience about Christ, him crucified, buried, and resurrected, and that crowd was guilty of his death, they cried out, "Men and brethren, what should we do?" And Peter responded by saying, "Repent and literally allow yourself to be immersed." That's the literal rendering of it. My point being that be baptized is in the passive. Every occurrence of baptism, of someone being baptized, is in the passive. William, you can nod your head on that, right?
Yes.
I didn't hear you, but I saw the nod. Okay. Yeah. He may be closing in on it, folks. Maybe. We'll wait and see. Now, in sharp contradistinction to that, folks, what do we have? Under the law of Moses, I don't know if you realize this or not, but under the law, when a Gentile wanted to become a proselyte, first of all, he had to be circumcised, physically circumcised. Secondly, he would be accompanied by a rabbi. The rabbi would walk to the edge of the water. The convert, the proselyte, would walk into the water and immerse themselves. The rabbi never baptized or immersed them. And you can find this in Lightfoot and other sources as well. And so this is a sharp distinction between, okay, let me see here. Read the chat. They say I can be heard on YouTube. Well, fantastic. Okay, let me go over there. There's the chat. I can hear you both. Well, I don't know what in the world is going on here then. Let me see, William. Got show chat previews. Okay. Audio. Same as system. Select a speaker. All of my settings. I'm on my snowball. Let me try something just for kicks and jollies, William. Switch my microphone. Now, say something for us.
All right, test 1, 2.
No.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Okay, mute. No, don't want to do that. I'm going to mute and unmute.
Okay, what about now?
Okay. I I don't know why I can't hear you. Um, my
Just muted me.
microphone and my speaker. Okay. Your default speaker has changed to speaker. Headset will now be used. Let me go back over here into my audio and go back to my snowball. Okay, that says I'm set up just like I always am, William.
Okay.
Ha! Bingo!
All righty.
All
Because
right.
I just got a message that said you muted me, and you did it about twice. I don't know
Yeah,
what you were
yeah.
doing over there.
Uh,
Anyway, good.
Here we are. I don't know what happened. When I looked down at my headset here, it was not quite fully seated on the USB. So I maybe that was it. I don't know. But so hey, it's good to have you, dude.
Good to be here after so many attempts.
Oh, after so many attempts. So you can hear what I was going over there about the distinction between proselyte conversion,
Hmm.
circumcision, and baptism. And here is Paul in Colossians chapter 2 saying to these Gentiles being pressured to be physically circumcised. Okay. And he says, you've already been circumcised, but it's a circumcision not made with hands. How does this all relate, William, to the Messianic temple when Paul says, hey, you've been circumcised and you were baptized?
Well, as far as the Messianic temple, as you were saying, the Gentiles couldn't enter. They were not circumcised. They couldn't enter into the old temple. But in terms of the Messianic temple, of course, it's a house not made with hands. They have a circumcision not made with hands. They've been baptized, and it was essential for them to be baptized in order to enter into it. So, from that perspective, their circumcision not made with hands was essential for their participation in the Messianic temple.
Yeah, excellent summary there. So now let's go back to Matthew chapter 5, as I pointed out a few moments ago. Now remember, here's the writer of Hebrews who says that old covenant system, in other words, that old covenant system of physical circumcision, immersion, those typological actions would stand valid and imposed binding until the time of Reformation. That meant that all of those new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths. Now, William, you and I were raised in a theological environment that said the law passed away at the cross. All of the feast days passed away at the cross. They were all fulfilled. Paul has something to say about that in Colossians chapter 2, even though I did when I was a younger man, seemed like a long time ago. But when I was a younger man, I would go right straight to Colossians chapter 2 and say, see, Paul said the law was nailed to the cross. Why don't you give us a brief exposition of Colossians chapter 2 and what it actually says, William?
Okay, Colossians 2, and I'm
Hmm.
just like you. We were taught that. We uh, repeated it often, thinking that is exactly what it was taught. But when we came to understand that, the law had to be fulfilled completely before it could pass away, and that it has much of what we talk about in eschatology in the law, in the very Decalogue. I mean, yeah, excuse me, not the Decalogue particularly, but in the Pentateuch. It has prophecies that relate all the way to the time of the end. You can just think of Genesis 3:15 and Genesis 49 and verse 10, just as a couple of them. But from that perspective, when he says the law or blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, that was contrary to us, taking it out of the way, he's talking about the debt, as far as I understand, the debt and or the obligation to keep the law was taken out of the way, was nailed to the cross. Not the fact that the law was taken away, because he tells you in the very same text that those things are, present tense, a shadow of the things that were about to come. And so, therefore, they were a shadow of the realities that were coming. and they could not have been if they had been taken away, or if they had been, if the law had been fulfilled at the cross. So, it's just a text that indicates that their debt and obligation to keep the law, they were no longer required to do it. I'm thinking of an illustration where when a person was under a contract and under debt, of course, he was obligated to pay it. But if they released that person from that contract, they would nail it, on a tree, like
Right.
make a public notice of it, so that they were no longer obligated to it. And that would release them from the obligation of paying that debt.
Yeah, and that's a great illustration. And it's important to understand that the word that is used here, here translated as handwriting of ordinances, is the word chirographon, hand, chirographon, writing. And so that's the way they did business in the ancient times. If you owed somebody something, you wrote out a bill of debt. Pardon me, we would call that an IOU. Okay, well, if the person that we owed it to forgave us that debt, or we were able to pay it off, in this case, there was no way for man to pay it off, but when the man that was owed took that debt away, as you just said, they would literally take that piece of parchment, they would nail it out in a public place so that anyone and everyone could understand that debt has been paid. There is no obligation. And by the way, folks, if you want a really, really great, just an excellent scholarly analysis of the Greek text of Colossians chapter 2, illustrating everything that William and I have just said, then go to my website, donkpreston.com and bibleprophecy.com, and look up the article on Colossians 2 by Dallas Burdett. In the search bar, just type in Dallas Burdett, and you will find several articles that he wrote on my website. Outstanding article, heavily documented. It is spot on. Now, this tells us that there was this tells us that there was a transition going on in the first century. There were those who had not come to Christ who were still observing the law, and it was necessary for them to fulfill the law. But then there were those coming to Christ. And Paul says in Romans chapter 7, you have become dead to the law by the body of Christ. Now, Paul is expressing really good, well understood Jewish practices. And that is, if a woman was married to a man, and if the man died, she was no longer under the law. And so Paul says in Romans chapter 6, do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? Well, what did that mean in relationship to the law? Well, they were still living biologically. The law was still alive, still being practiced, but they had entered the death of Christ. And so this is a very, very powerful illustration for the Jewish reader of Romans to understand, wow, well, yeah, we can understand this. We didn't die physically. Christ died. We entered the power of his death. We died to the law. The law didn't die. We died to the law. Well, I used to say Romans chapter 7 teaches that the law died. Just like I said that Colossians 2 says the law was nailed to the cross. I was wrong, because that's exactly the opposite of what it says. And you touched on it ever so briefly there, William, that Paul goes ahead to say, and this sets up a huge, huge problem. If we say, on the one hand, that Paul was saying, oh, the law was nailed to the cross, then that same apostle was evidently too undiscerning to realize that he immediately turned around and said the law was still present, active, indicative, a shadow of the good things that were about to come. How could Paul be so confused as to say, well, the law has been nailed to the cross, but we're still waiting for it to be fulfilled? I mean, That just makes no sense at all. Or as the saying goes, it doesn't even make good nonsense. So we and I pointed this out on our program several different times. It's really fascinating and sad all at the same time to see scholars, world-class scholars, struggle with the Greek tenses of Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17. Scott McKnight, in his otherwise excellent commentary on the book of Colossians, says, well, these Greek tenses here in Colossians chapter 2 continue to perplex the scholars. And so what they do is the scholars reimagine, that's his word, they reimagine the present active indicative and the future tenses that are found in Colossians 2:17. Now, what he means by that is they have this preconceived idea about what Paul said. But the Greek tenses violate their preconceived ideas. So they reject the Greek tenses and turn them into something that they're not. Folks, that is theology driving exegesis. That is not exegesis driving theology. And that's not the way to do things. So William Paul said that those new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths were all shadows of the good things about to come. I already touched on it earlier in the program when we couldn't hear you. But why don't you share with us the typological significance of what Paul is saying there by new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths? What feast might he have had in mind, and what did those feast days represent and symbolize?
Well, of course, when you talk about Sabbaths, all of the feast days were Sabbaths, as far as I understand it. And but also when he's talking about new moons, et cetera, he's one in particular was the Feast of Trumpets, where and that was, to my knowledge, the only one of the feast days that began with a new moon, which they called the unknown day.
Yeah.
And that's the idiom that we have in Matthew 24 and verse 36. Also taken from Zechariah 14, I think verse 6 as well.
Yeah.
Where we often hear, no man knows the day or the hour. Well, if you were talking to a Hebrew or Jew at the time, they would have fully understood what that idiom mean, that he was talking about the Feast of Trumpets. And he wasn't saying that they would never know the day. He wasn't even saying, as far as they were concerned, that they didn't know that it was going to happen on the first day of the 7th month. They knew that, but that precise time they didn't know. And that is precisely the way that the Lord is using it in Matthew 24 and 36 by saying that all of those things would occur within that generation, but of the precise day and hour, no man knew. And so he's using that Greek idiom. And so from that perspective, those were types and shadows of the good things that were about to come. So as long as they stood, they were foreshadowing what would take place at the coming of the kingdom of God, at the parousia, at the coming of the Messianic temple in its fullness. All of those things stood until that time. And that's why he says they are. And that present tense there is very, very significant. We've pointed it out several times in the book of Hebrews, over and over again, with several of the passages that we discussed there. And that's why when it says the old covenant had become obsolete and it was ready to vanish away, the time for it to vanish away was at hand or near, but it had not completely done so. Why? Because the law was still having a shadow of the good things that were about to come.
And you touched on it and you pointed out how Matthew chapter 24, 36, a good Hebrew of the first century would understand that's a festal reference, but of that day and hour knows no man. Well, that's Rosh Hashanah. And that's Zechariah chapter 14. I have made note of that in several conversations with people, and I've just been met with overt criticism and condemnation and ridicule for saying such a thing. But I really, really like what Brent Petrie in his little book, The Case for Jesus. It's not a big book. It's only about that big. It's just full, absolutely full of great historical gems into the world of the first century Jew. one of the things that he points out is that so often what Jesus did in his personal ministry, and he says it's frustrating to us as moderns, Western people, trained in Grecian thought and the way of dealing things. But he said Jesus was answering the audiences in really, really good Jewish manner, rabbinic manner. And that is, they so very, very often did not give an absolutely direct answer. Are you this? Well, today we would say, well, yeah, sure, of course. That's who I am. But Jesus would very often say, are you the Messiah? And Jesus would say, tell me what you think of David. How could David say, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand? Well, Brent Petrie points out that was a perfectly legitimate, understood way of doing things. That he was answering them in a way that caused them to think and to reflect on, okay, where's he quoting from? Oh, Psalms 110. Oh, yeah, that's a problem. So that what Petrie is pointing out, once again, let me reiterate this. We would expect, we would demand, we would be totally frustrated at so much of the teaching of Jesus, because we would expect him to say this in a very direct, forthright, candid manner. And yet the natural Jewish way of dealing with issues was by asking other questions, questions that caused the listener to think. And one of the examples that he gives is in Mark chapter 2. And the famous story of this man who had the palsy. Jesus is in a house. His friends let him down through the roof so that Jesus can heal him. And Jesus says, son, your sins are forgiven you. Well, the sanctimonious Jews standing around said, what in the world is this man doing? Only God, and what they mean by that is the only true God can forgive sins. They would use the Greek term his ho theos, the one true God. Only true God can forgive sins. And Jesus, you can just imagine him standing there looking around and say, okay, guys, you ready for this? So that you may know that the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins, he said, take up your bed and walk. He healed the man. That was his indirect and yet extremely powerful and effective way of saying, guys, you're right. Only God can forgive sin, and I just did. Extremely powerful. But he didn't express it in ways that we would like for him to.
They got the point because, for example, with Nicodemus, he said, well, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who comes from God, for no man can do these miracles that you do except God is with him. And on other occasions, when, like at the time when Caiaphas and the leaders, when they wanted to put Jesus to death, they said, look, here's a miracle. We can't deny it. All the world will believe on him if we don't do something about it. So they knew that he was, working those miracles. And even afterwards, the Sanhedrin said, here's a notable miracle and we cannot deny it. So
yeah,
they definitely attested to the fact of his divinity.
That's right. While Jesus may not have addressed them the way that we would like, they were used to the way that he was addressing them and the audiences, and they definitely got the point. There's no question about it. That's why they said, as Jesus healed a man in John chapter 10, they took up stones to stone him. When he said, I and the Father are one. Well, they knew what that meant. Jesus wasn't saying what Psalms 82 said, you're all the sons of God. Are you not gods? No, they understood he was saying something way, 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 way more than that. So they took up stones, and he says, for which good work do you stone me? Do you seek to kill me? And they said, we're not trying to stone you for any good work. We're trying to stone you and to kill you because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God.
Mhm.
That was blasphemy. And so, yes, once again, they understood the manner of communication very, very clearly. We have to stay attuned to that. And we're out of time tonight. So we've just touched the hem of the garment of where we want to go with this new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths being a shadow of the good things that were about to come. We're working our way toward the fact that the law was imposed until the time of Reformation. In the meantime, thanks for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Sure glad we got that audio worked out, William. And at this point, I'm thinking that it was my USB that wasn't plugged in right. I don't know, but
I
glad
don't
to
know.
have, yeah, who knows? Great. Okay, folks, thanks again for joining us. We'll see you again next week here on Two Guys in a Bible on Voice You Can Trust. Good night and God bless.
Good night.
All right, William. I think I got supper waiting on me.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Man, I am so worn out. I had a 2 hour interview this afternoon,
Oh, did you?
and yeah, it was a ball because I had some folks asking questions, trying to trip me up,
Hmm.
and in my estimation, it backfired on them really, really
Now,
bad.
who was this with?
Okay, let me get this. Jacob Berman.
Oh, okay.
Do you know him?
I don't know him.
Okay.
What organization?
I don't even know that he's got an organization. He's got he told me that he's basically a skeptic, but
Mm.
he has people on, that are atheists, some that are Christian, et cetera, and he wanted to introduce them to preterism. So it was I mean, he basically just let me talk, let me explain, and what have you. And then during the Q&A, you can imagine some of the IO people that were there
Hmm.
waiting to pounce. And yeah, that didn't go well.
Whose channel was it on? Was it on Derek Lambert?
No,
Oh, okay.
no, actually, Derek uh, asked a question, during the Q&A, but it wasn't on his channel at all.
Oh, okay. Did you see where he exposed this Char Patterson guy?
No.
You didn't see that? He
No.
sent a video out, and he said that he was curious, and he finally contacted this Char Patterson and asked him who he was. And he said he was thinking that it was Michael Byrus, or what's his name? Byrus,
Virus, yeah.
and or Jason DaCosta. But he
Yeah,
said, I really don't think it's DaCosta. He says, I think it's Michael Byrus. I personally thought it was DaCosta
I did too.
because of the wording that he used.
Right.
It's some of the same rhetoric that DaCosta uses,
Yeah.
and the same attitude, in
Yeah.
the way that he addresses
Oh,
things.
just ugly, ugly,
Yes,
ugly.
yes, yes. But some of those words that he used are the words, clown, and it's
Yeah.
some other things that he does. That's DaCosta all day long.
Yeah.
But anyway, he pointed it out. So they told him that, if you can't tell us who you are, you don't belong on this platform. So I think they canceled him off.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Well, some of these guys, and I've said this before, and I don't know if our folks there on YouTube can hear this or not, but I've said this before. I've never met a truly honest IO representative.
Mm.
Now, I'm not saying that every single person, some of which have been deceived by it, I'm not saying that they're
Yeah.
dishonest, but I'm certainly saying that the leaders of that movement, I have yet to find an honest one. And that says a whole lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. It really does.
All right, man.
I mean, to me, once they admitted that none Israelite Gentiles could come in, I mean, even
Oh,
before then, but it's over. It's a wrap.
yeah. When Tristan Gabriel himself says, I've already proven that Gentiles, non-Israelites could be accepted into Israel and were accepted into Israel. Well, I'm sorry, then Israel only is dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Gone.
it's
All right.
crazy. All right.
Okay.
Good
All
night.
right. Let's see.
Yeah.